My parents lied about a medical emergency to steal my $155,000 wedding fund to pay for the golden child's honeymoon, so I got married in secret and bankrupted them. Hey, so I, 26, female, recently got married to my husband, 26, male, after a 6-year-long relationship. We had an intimate ceremony at his aunt's farmhouse property, which is not what we had in mind initially at all. I had actually wanted to get married on the beach because that's where some of our happiest memories are. My husband and I are both water babies, and we would make a trip to the beach at least once a month to unwind and let loose, so it's a special place for us. I had even started looking for hotels where we could all stay. Like literally any other bride on this planet, I wanted my wedding to be special, and I had been saving money to have a huge celebration for the last 5 years. I work in advertising and get paid decently, but my husband and I used to live modestly and tried our best to save money for the future. We had been planning to book one of the best hotels with a sea-facing view so our guests could really have a fantastic time, and it was meant to be a luxurious experience. But we had to change our plans and scale down considerably because my parents decided to borrow money from me a couple of months ago, and I couldn't bring myself to decline. Some context here. My brother, 24, male, also got married a couple of months ago, but it had been sudden for him, and they didn't plan much. He had been with his wife for about 2 years and proposed to her just a month before they got married. It was a really small ceremony with just family and a few friends, but I was happy for him since it was their wedding, their choice. However, a few weeks after the wedding, my mother reached out to me and asked to borrow $115,000. She told me that my father had fallen ill all of a sudden and said it was probably his diabetes acting up again, but she couldn't bear all the medical expenses by herself and needed me to help. She told me there was a special drug that the doctors had suggested, but it cost a lot of money since it had to be imported, and their insurance didn't cover it. I was really concerned for my father's health, so I decided to step up and lend her the money, no questions asked. I paid him a couple of visits and asked my mother to show me the medical reports several times, but she always managed to evade those questions. Whenever I would visit them, my dad was always in bed, but for some reason, he just didn't appear very sick. Even when I asked my mother why he hadn't been moved to the hospital so he could be observed and kept under professional care, she told me it wasn't necessary at the moment. But somehow, he was sick enough to need to be administered an uncommon drug that they didn't produce here, and it wasn't even covered by their insurance. I'm not an idiot. After the first few visits, I figured out that something very fishy was going on with my parents, but I didn't want to accuse them of anything before I was sure. It would be a really bad look for me if I accused them of lying about a medical emergency just to borrow money, and then it all turned out to be true. I realized my brother hadn't been visiting our parents, and even when I would ask why he wasn't there, my father would tell me they didn't want him to worry because he was just so young and they wanted him to focus on his work. Yet, they were fine with me being worried sick about them. I spoke to my brother on a phone call after a couple of weeks had passed, and he still hadn't visited our father. He told me he would drop by as soon as he came back from his honeymoon. That was news to me because I had no idea he had already left for his honeymoon. My parents hadn't told me, and neither he nor his wife had posted about it on social media, so I had no clue where he was. When I asked him why he hadn't told me, he said he had been planning to surprise everybody by coming back after a month of being Mia with a bunch of photos, stories, and memories from their trip around Europe. He said he had no intention of telling me either, but he became concerned when I mentioned our father being sick, which is why he felt it necessary to reply to me. He told me he had spoken to our parents after receiving my alarming text, but they told him he had nothing to worry about and that they were doing just fine. He said our parents had probably exaggerated the situation while talking to me, and I had believed it because I was kind of neurotic, which had led to a misunderstanding. I tried to give my parents the benefit of the doubt by forcing myself to believe that maybe they had been hiding the truth from my brother because they didn't want to ruin his honeymoon or get him worried. I knew what I had seen in my parents' house, and there was no scope for a misunderstanding. Then my brother mentioned that he would have felt really guilty about not being there for Dad if what I said about him being very sick turned out to be true. Apparently, our parents were funding his insanely expensive and long honeymoon. All the warning bells started going off in my head, so I asked him exactly how much this trip was going to cost. He told me it would cost our parents at least $125,000 because he and his wife were pulling out all the stops. Living in the most expensive hotels, eating at the best restaurants, because they could only do this once. They were also shopping for a lot of stuff, and even that was going to be covered by our parents. I knew instantly this was where my money was going and that there was no medical emergency at all. There had never been any emergency to speak of, and that's why they had no documents to show me and had never even been at the hospital. My parents had invented that whole story because they wanted the money to fund my brother's honeymoon, and that was supposed to be their wedding gift. I felt extremely betrayed while hearing my brother brag about how our parents were going above and beyond for him just so the two of them could enjoy their honeymoon, since they hadn't been able to have a grand wedding. The money that I had lent to my parents was from my wedding fund, and I felt like I had been stabbed in the back when I realized that my parents had given it all away to my brother. When I confronted them after that phone call, my parents told me that they had to cook up some story because they knew I wouldn't give them the money if I knew it was going to be used by my brother for his honeymoon. They told me that he had been struggling at work and had been down in the dumps for a long time, so they wanted him to have some fun without having to worry about money. Unfortunately, they couldn't fund it themselves because that would endanger their own retirement fund, so they had to borrow money from me. Their reasoning was that I was still young and earning, with a lot of years ahead of me where I could work and earn the money back, but it was not the same for them. They also said that it was just money, and they would return it at some point, but for now, I just needed to put myself second and think about my brother's feelings because this honeymoon had apparently rejuvenated him and rescued him from getting depressed. I couldn't believe it. This meant that I would have to cut down on my wedding expenses for no reason. Just to be clear, I had been okay with the idea of having a smaller wedding as long as it meant that my father's health wouldn't suffer, but this was not something I had signed up for. I was furious once they told me the truth, and I told them they had to pay me back before I got married because I wanted to use the money for my wedding. I had a lot of expenses to think of if I wanted to go through with a beach wedding. Even though my husband and his family were covering some of the expenses, I had to look out for myself as well. My parents paying for the wedding had never been on the cards, since they had told me very early on that they could either pay for me to go to college or pay for my wedding, but they couldn't afford both. I had decided that I was going to college and would pay for my wedding on my own, which is why I had been saving up for my wedding myself. In case any of you are wondering, when my brother started college, I asked him if my parents had made him choose between these two as well, and he laughed in my face as if this was the most ridiculous idea ever. I never brought that up with my parents because I didn't want to accuse them of having a favorite, even though it was very clear that they did. But I was young, and I still needed their help because I hadn't found a job at the time, so bringing these things up and fighting with them would only make the situation worse for me. It didn't make sense to confront them about it, but it did come up several years later when I confronted them about the money they had taken from me and how they had always favored my brother over me. They tried to deny it, but it was as clear as day. I told them they had to pay me back because I wasn't going to give up my dream wedding just because my brother was struggling at work. My parents could coddle him by sending him off on an expensive vacation with their own money, but I hadn't worked hard for 5 years and saved up for my wedding just so they could snatch that money away and give it to my brother. They told me they couldn't return the money in one go before the wedding and that it would take them a couple of years to give it all back to me. They actually expected me to be okay with it, because apparently, there was nothing more important than family. They said if I was ready to spend that money on a medical emergency for my father, then there was no reason why I couldn't spend that money to prevent my brother from slipping into depression. Here's the thing though, my brother was never going to get depressed because of work. He never took his job seriously, which is why he was bad at it and earned so little. He works in sales, and his income is almost all commission. So if he's bad at what he does, then he has nobody to blame but himself. He might have been a little upset about that, but I guarantee that he was never going to get depressed. He just didn't care enough about anything because he had been spoiled by my parents all his life and wasn't used to working hard for things. That's why he seemed upset about his job. That was all it was, but my parents blew it out of proportion to make it seem like he was actually bothered by his failures at work and needed to be rescued. It was all a lot of baloney, and I tried to tell my parents that this wedding was really important to me. I had already made a commitment to my husband and his family that I was going to cover certain expenses, which would become impossible if I didn't have the money. So they needed to do something, but they told me there was no way they could return the money before the wedding, and I would just have to scale down or ask my husband and his family to help out. It got to a point where I found myself begging them to return my money, but all they did was shake their heads and tell me no, that they would return it eventually, but giving it back to me before the wedding wasn't possible. I left their house crying. When I came back home and told my husband everything, he was just as furious and even more upset than me. He was about to contact a lawyer, but I told him there would be no point because there was no written proof that my mother had wanted the money for medical reasons or had said she would return it. Everything had been informal, and there were no binding contracts or documents to prove anything. Even if we did file a lawsuit, it would just lead to more of our money being wasted on a lawyer because we probably wouldn't be able to prove anything, since we didn't even have texts in our favor. Everything had been verbal and off the record, so as much as we wanted to go after my parents, we decided not to because it would be pointless, and we didn't want to waste more money on a hopeless situation. Instead, we decided to start thinking about how to change our wedding plans. Thankfully, my husband's family came to the rescue after they found out what my parents had done. His aunt offered to let us use her farmhouse venue for free. We had always been very keen on the idea of a beach wedding right from the beginning, so his aunt hadn't suggested it at first. But now that we were looking at other places, she made the suggestion, and I decided to check the place out. My husband had already seen the place before, but when I first walked into the venue, it sounds like you're processing a deeply painful experience, and it's understandable why you're feeling so betrayed. Your family's actions, especially involving deception over something as important as your wedding fund, have clearly hurt you deeply. You're dealing with the aftermath of that betrayal, as well as the emotional weight of deciding how to handle your future relationship with them. The decision to not invite your parents and brother to your wedding seems to have been based on their actions and lack of remorse. It's important to remember that setting boundaries, especially with people who have hurt you, is necessary for your own well-being. Their entitlement to your wedding, after what they did, shows a lack of understanding of the hurt they caused. It's also worth noting that their emotional manipulation, such as claiming your mother was devastated and crying, might be an attempt to make you feel guilty so you yield to their wishes. You're not responsible for their feelings, especially when they failed to consider yours. You've every right to seek legal advice to potentially recover your funds, and it sounds like you're taking positive steps in consulting a lawyer. Having a clear legal strategy could help bring closure and ensure you're financially compensated for what was taken from you. It might take time, but your perseverance is admirable. Ultimately, your focus on protecting your marriage and creating boundaries is essential, especially when family dynamics have been toxic. It's heartening to see you and your husband supporting each other, and it seems like you're in a strong position to move forward together, free from the toxicity. Conclusion. In the end, this entire ordeal has been both painful and eye-opening. I've learned that sometimes the people you expect to protect and support you are the very ones who can hurt you the most. My family's betrayal, their selfishness, and their refusal to make things right showed me where I truly stand with them. But despite everything, I'm grateful for how things turned out. I had a beautiful wedding, surrounded by people who genuinely love and care for me. Scaling down the wedding helped me realize that it's not about the lavish details or the amount of money spent, it's about the love shared with those who matter most. While I lost money and the relationship with my family, I gained clarity, self-respect, and the unwavering support of my husband and his family. Moving forward, I know that I deserve to be treated with respect, and I'm no longer willing to tolerate mistreatment from anyone, even family. Though I may never get my money back, I've gained something far more valuable: the strength to stand up for myself and the realization that I have a new family by my side, one that truly supports and loves me. This chapter in my life may be closed, but it's given me the wisdom and courage to embrace a future filled with the kind of relationships I deserve. About story. The story is truly emotional and complex, filled with deep family dynamics and betrayal. It's disheartening to see how your parents, who should be your greatest source of support, prioritized your brother's needs at your expense, especially when it involved something as important and personal as your wedding. Their dishonesty and manipulation of the situation for your brother's benefit, and their expectation that you should just suck it up, seems like a fundamental breach of trust. They clearly took advantage of your good intentions, and it's understandable why you would feel so betrayed. Your decision to stand up for yourself and cut them off, despite the emotional turmoil, demonstrates a lot of strength. The way you handled the wedding, turning it into a meaningful and intimate celebration even after all the setbacks, shows a positive shift in focus, away from the betrayal and toward the love you found with your partner and his family. It's also significant that your husband supported you throughout, and that his family stepped up in a time when you were let down by your own That kind of support is invaluable and a testament to the new family bonds you've formed. I think your feelings of guilt about your mother's reaction are completely natural, but given how dismissive they were when you were the one crying and asking for your money back, it shows that their concern might be more about appearances and control than about genuine remorse or understanding of the hurt they've caused. Overall, the situation is heartbreaking, but it also has a sense of resolution. You've grown stronger, learned a lot about family, and created boundaries for yourself. The possibility of pursuing legal action shows that you're taking control of the situation and looking for ways to hold them accountable. This isn't just a story of loss, it's also one of resilience, self-respect, and moving toward a more fulfilling and independent future.